I remember the first time I stepped inside that place. The air was heavy, almost sticky, carrying the faint scent of something old, cleaning fluid, rust, and something I couldn't name. Outside, the trees pressed close, their bare branches scraping the gray sky like skeletal fingers. A low fog curled along the ground, softening the edges of broken windows and rusted gates. I could hear the echo of my own footsteps, stretched and hollow in the long, empty hallways. The walls were pale, almost white under the flickering fluorescent lights, but the light itself seemed hesitant, trembling above me, as if it didn't want to reveal everything. Every room I passed hummed with silence, but not the kind that comforts. It was thick, waiting, watching. Somewhere far off, a door creaked. I paused. My breath came in quiet bursts, my heart beat a steady, distant drum. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, curling along the peeling wallpaper. I thought I saw a figure, pale and thin, standing at the end of a corridor just beyond reach. I blinked. It was gone. And yet, I knew I wasn't imagining it. That's when I saw it. Or maybe it saw me first. A whisper of movement, a presence, a patient waiting. I never should have followed that sound. The hallway smelled of damp paint and cold stone. A pale light flickered overhead, hesitating, casting the walls in uneven shadows that seemed to stretch and shiver. I pressed my hand to the peeling surface. It was colder than it should be, slick against my skin. It felt alive, almost breathing. A whisper brushed my ear, soft, indistinct. I froze. The corridor stretched empty before me. The light above wavered, and the shadows danced closer to the floor. I could hear the faint rustle of something sliding along the walls. I leaned in, trying to catch a word. A small door at the end of the hall shuddered. It creaked open without anyone touching it. The hinges moaned, long and low, like a tired voice sighing. I stepped closer, heart slowing. But the floor beneath my feet groaned with each careful step. The whispers grew sharper, but still no shape appeared. The air was thick with cold, carrying a faint metallic tang. It made my tongue dry. I swallowed, the sound loud in my own ears. I touched the door. The wood was slick, damp, as if it had been crying for years. I drew my hand back, startled by a subtle pulse, like it had its own heartbeat. The whispers lingered. They circled me, curling around the corners, and every time I thought I knew where they came from, they were gone. The flickering light caught on a crack in the paint. A shadow shifted behind it, just at the edge of vision. I blinked and it vanished. A soft hum rose from the walls. Not mechanical, not familiar, just there, beneath the surface, underneath the silence. I leaned closer to the corridor wall, ear brushing the cold plaster. The whispers formed into syllables I could not name. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted. The door moved again. It whispered open further, slow, deliberate, revealing nothing but more shadows. Yet I could feel a presence behind it, waiting. I pressed my cheek to the wall, feeling the damp seep into my clothes, into my skin. The whispers rose in pitch, soft and insistent, but the hallway itself remained empty. A shiver ran down my spine. The pale light flickered once, twice, and then steadied, almost as if nothing had stirred. The corridor smelled of decay, rust, and the faint scent of old paper. I could hear my own breath, loud in the quiet, but not loud enough to disturb whatever lingered. The whispers softened, curling away, as if teasing me, inviting me deeper. And then silence. I took a step. The door creaked behind me. A shadow lingered at the threshold, but when I turned, nothing met my gaze. Cold pressed against my back. A soft rustle brushed past my shoulder. I stopped, held my breath. The hallway stretched on, endless. The pale light washing the walls in trembling patches. Whispers drifted just out of reach, and the small door remained slightly open, invited me to look, to step, to listen. I didn't move. I couldn't move. But I couldn't leave either. And somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, the walls whispered my name. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old linen. Pale light pooled in the corner, uneven, trembling. Shadows lingered where the walls met the floor, dark and still. A figure rocked gently in the corner, humming a melody I didn't know. It drifted into the air, curling around me, pressing against my chest. Their gaze found mine. unblinking, patient. The eyes held a stillness that made my skin crawl. I stepped closer, the floor cold beneath my feet. The hum grew softer, yet somehow heavier. I couldn't place the tune, but it sank into me like a memory I never lived. They whispered, not words I understood, but the meaning pressed deep, tight against my ribs. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. The air smelled faintly of paper and wet stone, and the faint rustle of their movements stirred my hair. The room tilted, or maybe it was me. When I blinked, they were closer, not walking, not moving in any way I could measure, just nearer. I wanted to look away, but their calm had held me. It pressed against the edges of my mind, soft and unrelenting. The hum shifted, weaving through the corners of the room. A subtle vibration rose from the floor beneath me, or perhaps it was under the walls, under everything. Their whispering continued, and I realized the words were not for my ears. They were for something else, or something within me. I noticed the pale light glinting off their eyes, glass or dew, or something else I could not name. The shadows in the corner thickened, bending toward them. I breathed slowly, tasting the metallic tang of fear, but it did not burn. It settled, low, steady, pressing at the base of my spine. I took another step. The hum shifted with me, a soft, imperceptible shuffle, and again they were closer. I pressed my back to the wall, cold plaster against my skin, grounding me, yet the whispering followed, curling along my collarbone, sliding down my arm. The room smelled faintly of wax and dust, and the hum had flattened into a single note, a pulse that matched the beat of my own heart. Their eyes never wavered, unblinking, unmoving, yet I knew they saw something beyond the room, beyond me. I tried to speak, but my voice refused. The whisper in the corner pressed into my chest again, and I felt it. A knowledge I shouldn't have, an understanding that settled like frost beneath my skin. I blinked, and they were gone. Or maybe I was. The corner remained empty, yet the air still trembled. The hum lingered, faint now, like the last thread of a dream dissolving at dawn. I touched the floor, cold, solid, real, but when I drew my hand back, the shadow at the corner seemed to pulse in response. A soft exhale left my lips, and the room returned to silence. The faint antiseptic smell hung in the air. The linen rustled as if someone had just moved. I did not leave. I could not leave. The figure had vanished, but the knowing remained. It lingered in the pale light, in the hush of the room, and in the steady thrum of my own chest. I stayed, alone, yet not alone. The atrium smelled faintly of damp stone and sun-warmed air. Sunlight filtered through the skylights, but it was muted, soft, caught in a haze of fog. Pale light stretched across the tiles, flickering and wavering like it couldn't settle. I stepped lightly, the floor cool beneath my shoes. A rustle came from behind a plant. I froze. Nothing, only leaves quivering in the stagnant air. A faint metallic tang lingered, sharp on the tongue, and my own breath sounded loud in the emptiness. The footsteps came next, soft, echoing, but not mine. They circled the space, moving where no one walked. Each step stretched the silence thinner. I pressed my hand against the cool railing. The fog clung to my fingers, moist and cold. It whispered along the edges of my coat, sliding under my collar. A chair rocked in the corner. Slowly, deliberately, it creaked against the floor, timid yet impossible to ignore. The fog thickened near the center, curling around the bases of plants, the edges of statues. I could see it move in patterns, like someone breathing against the glass. The light shifted. Pale shapes stretched along the tiles. They bent and twisted, then vanished when I tried to follow them. I took another step. The footsteps echoed again, closer, yet still empty space surrounded me. I bent to touch a leaf. It trembled under my fingers. The rustling rose again, soft, teasing, like a warning held just at the edge of hearing. The chair continued its slow rocking. I watched the shadow beneath it stretch and shrink with each movement. The floor smelled faintly of wet stone, and the fog carried it upward, clinging to my hair, my clothes. I tried to tell myself I was alone. The atrium was empty. Still, the fog moved against me, as if breathing, as if watching. I stepped closer to the center. Light danced on the tiles, catching on the edges of invisible shapes. My own shadow trembled, stretching toward the fog like it wanted to escape. Another rustle, closer this time. I felt it brush against my arm, or was it just a chill sliding along my sleeve? The chair stopped rocking. The footsteps faded. Only my breath remained, loud and shallow in the fog, curling along the floor, unbroken, waiting. I pressed my palm to the tiles. Cold, solid, the pale light trembled across the surface. The air smelled faintly of dust and sun. I wanted to move, but my feet felt weighted by the fog, by the silence, by the presence I could not name. The atrium stayed quiet, yet I was not alone. The fog lingered around me, soft, enveloping, patient. I didn't leave. I couldn't leave. I stood there, watching the pale light bend along the tiles, listening to the emptiness breathe around me, and waiting. The security room smelled of warm electronics and faint ozone. A low hum settled in the air, vibrating through the walls and floor. Monitors flickered in pale, fractured light, each screen a frozen world of emptiness. I leaned closer to one. A hallway, empty. Another screen, an office, chairs still, shadows pressing to corners. Then one monitor caught me off guard. Someone stood behind me. I spun. Nothing. The room stayed still, the hum steady. But my skin prickled, as if it knew something I couldn't see. A metallic taste rose at the back of my tongue. The static on the screens hissed softly. It seemed alive, writhing under the pale light. Each flicker stretched shadows along the walls, shifting where no body moved. I stepped toward the monitors. The buttons beneath my fingers were cool, smooth, unyielding. Yet the feeling remained, someone or something pressing against the air behind me. A shadow drifted across the wall, slow, unconnected to any person. It bent and stretched in ways that made my stomach tighten. I reached out. It recoiled from my fingertips, as if it remembered boundaries I did not. I traced the edge of a monitor, cold metal under my hand, humming beneath my palm. The static curled around my senses, clinging to the back of my neck, brushing my hair. The air tasted faintly of dust and electricity. I could hear the soft click of buttons, my own heartbeat. Every exhale seemed too loud. I turned again. Nothing. Yet I could feel eyes on the back of my head, the invisible weight of someone or something, watching, waiting. The flickering lights from the monitors danced along the walls. Shapes formed, then dissolved. The shadows whispered in corners I could not reach. I pressed my forehead to the desk. The cold surface steadied me. The hum of electronics filled the space between heartbeats, and the static wrapped around the edges of my vision. I took a breath. The shadow moved again, sliding along the wall. It paused long enough to make the air heavy, then faded, leaving only the faint echo of presence. I reached toward another screen. A hallway, empty, a door, still. Nothing changed, yet the feeling persisted. A subtle pressure against my chest, a whisper curling around the base of my skull. I pulled back from the desk. The hum softened. The static on the monitors thinned, but I could still feel it, lingering in the corners of the room, watching. I did not move. I could not move. The shadow had vanished, but the knowledge it remained like a chill that seeped into my bones, silent, patient, and waiting for me to breathe again. The room smelled of old paper and wax polish. A faint sunlight filtered through the blinds, soft and trembling. Dust hung in the air, stirring with each careful step I took. A cabinet stood in the corner, locked, solid, silent. I pressed my fingers to the wood. Cold, smooth, unyielding. The lock gave under my touch, clicking with a sound that echoed farther than it should. Inside, a journal rested, small, worn, waiting. I lifted it. The leather cover was stiff, scented of mildew and ink. It trembled lightly in my hands, as if aware. I opened the first page. The handwriting was frantic, looping, curling in ways my eyes strained to follow. The words seemed alive, shifting under my gaze, stretching and folding into sentences I did not see before the faint hum rose from a room, or perhaps from the journal itself. I could feel it against my palm, soft and insistent, pressing into the pulse at my wrist. That I turned the page slowly. The lines writhed like smoke, and the smell of damp paper deepened, tinged with something I could not name. Iron, cold and raw. The words began to whisper, not in sound, but in thought, curling into the edges of my mind. I tried to step back, but the journal pressed forward, pulling my focus, tugging at something I did not want to release. That I read the next page. A sentence shifted beneath my eyes. I blinked. It was different, and then different again. That I felt a chill lower my spine and a sense of something unlocking, something better left sealed. The air grew heavier, and I could hear the soft rustle of paper as though turning itself. The shadow brushed against the wall. I looked up. Nothing moved, but the weight of the unseen presence lingered, pressing at my shoulders, at my chest. I held the journal closer. The leather warmed now beneath my fingertips, and a metallic tang rose on my tongue. My breath caught, shallow, quick. The words shifted again. I felt my mind stretch, pulled toward thoughts I did not understand but recognized. Deep, buried things that whispered in memory I could not name. I closed the journal briefly, afraid of what I might see next, but the pull did not ease. The hum continued, soft, steady, wrapping around the room like fog. I opened it once more. The letters curled into shapes that were not letters, then unfolded into thoughts that pressed against my chest. I understood them without speaking, and I feared what I had unlocked. The room grew still. The dust settled. The pale sunlight trembled across the floor. I could hear my heartbeat, loud, steady, and the whisper of my own breathing. I placed the journal back in the cabinet. The lock clicked shut, final, sharp. But the sense of something released lingered. A shadow at the edge of my vision. A hum beneath the floorboards. A presence that waited. I stepped back. The cabinet stood silent, but I could feel the memory it held, and the knowledge that some doors, once opened, never truly close. I left the room, alone, but carrying the weight of what had been unlocked, softly, quietly, pressing against my chest as I walked into the silence beyond. The hall smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm wood. Pale light spilled from the high windows, fractured by dust in the air. A soft melody drifted, almost too quiet to notice, curling around the corners. I moved slowly, bare feet brushing the cold floor. The tune wrapped itself around me, gentle, soothing. Yet beneath it, there was a sadness, low and steady, like a heartbeat I could not see. I followed the sound, past doors with chipped paint, past shadows that quivered in the pale light. The music seemed to breathe with me, sliding along my arms, settling at my shoulders. A subtle brush pressed there, soft, invisible, familiar. I stopped. No one was there, yet the lullaby continued, curling into my chest, and I felt its weight, a melancholy I could not name. The hall stretched ahead, empty and silent, save for the soft folding of the melody through the air. Light bent along the walls, pale and trembling. Dust stirred at my feet. I leaned against the wall. The cold plaster pressed against my cheek, grounding me, but the hand on my shoulder lingered, soft, hesitant, patient. The notes wound through the space, rising and falling, and the air smelled faintly of wax and faint perfume. A subtle vibration hummed beneath the floorboards, or perhaps it rose from the melody itself. I walked slowly. The tune shifted, bending around corners, twisting to the fog of light that pooled on the tiles. Shadows lengthened, but did not reach for me. I turned a corner. The hallway was empty. Still, the lullaby followed, curling around my ribs, pressing gently, insistently, as if guiding me forward. I reached the door. It stood slightly ajar. Light spilled in pale, trembling streams. The melody softened like a sigh, and I felt the invisible hand retreat, leaving a faint warmth against my shoulder. I pressed my palm to the doorframe. The wood was smooth, warm under my fingers. The melody faded slowly, leaving only the echo of sadness in the empty hall. I stepped inside. The room was quiet, still. Light pooled across the floor, fractured by dust motes. The faint scent of wax lingered. I stood in the center, alone, yet not alone. The memory of the lullaby pressed in the quiet, soft as breath against my ear, gentle, patient melancholy. I did not move. I could not move. The music had gone, but its presence lingered, like an unseen hand resting lightly, holding me in place, watching, waiting. The service elevator smelled faintly of oil and damp metal. Pale light flickered overhead. catching on the scratch panels. I stepped inside. The doors closed behind me with a soft sigh. The cabin shuddered, low and slow, as if waking from a long sleep. I did not press any buttons. It descended, smoothly, but not in the way I expected. The hum of the motor thrummed beneath my feet, and the air felt heavier, colder, pressing against my chest. The walls seemed to bend inward slightly, shadows curling along the corners like smoke. I could smell faint rust and something metallic, like blood beneath wet stone. The elevator slowed. The doors opened. The floor stretched before me. Darker, colder, a place I did not recognize. The pale light from above barely reached the tiles, and fog drifted low across the ground, curling around my shoes. I took a step. Soft, careful. Something shifted in the corner. I could not see it fully, only the sense of it, breathing, patient, watching. The air trembled slightly with each inhale. The walls were silent. The fog clung to my ankles. A metallic tang rose on my tongue, and the floor felt colder than anything I had touched before. I glanced back at the elevator. It waited silently, its doors half open, faint hum lingering inside. The figure or shadow in the corner did not move. It breathed slowly. Patiently, the darkness seemed to thicken around it. I stepped closer. The tiles were slick, damp with condensation. The faint smell of ozone drifted through the air, and I could hear my own heartbeat loud in the silence. I wanted to speak, to say something, but my voice caught in my throat. The presence remained silent, patient, observing. The fog drifted, curling along the walls. Pale light trembled against it, stretching shadows. I pressed my hand to the wall, cold and damp, but it did not help. The figure shifted slightly. Or perhaps it was a shadow on the wall. Either way, it was enough. The air seemed to pulse with his attention. I took another step. The floorboards creaked faintly beneath my feet. Breath left me shallow, quick. The presence in the corner remained still, but I could feel it lean closer, just at the edge of my awareness. I did not move. I could not move. The elevator hummed behind me, silent and patient, and the dark floor before me seemed endless. I pressed my palm to my chest. The cold pressed back. The fog swirled around my ankles. The shadow breathed, and I knew it had been waiting. I did not leave. I could not leave. I stood, alone, with the air trembling and the unseen eyes watching me from the corner. The therapy room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and coal glass. Pale light drifted through the high windows, fractured across the mirrored walls. The air was still, heavy, almost listening. I stepped inside. The floor tiles were smooth beneath my feet, cool, reflective, echoing the soft hum of the building around me. I saw my reflection. At first, it was the same, but then it lagged, a subtle delay in the movement of my arms. My head tilted a moment after I had moved. The glass felt unnaturally cold under my fingertips. I reached toward it. The reflection did too, but not exactly. Its fingers lingered, almost brushing mine. A shiver ran up my spine. The smell of polished wood and dust deepened, like the room had aged decades in the seconds I stood there. The reflection shifted its expression. A smile, slow, not mine. I stopped moving. The air trembled around me, pressing softly against my skin. My own breath sounded loud in the quiet, and the faint hum of the building carried through the glass. I stepped closer. The tiles beneath me seemed to hold a subtle vibration. The reflection mirrored the motion, but the smile grew wider, patient, knowing. I blinked. The glass fogged slightly, tiny beads of condensation forming at the edges. The reflection remained, lagging, smiling, as if enjoying the pause between reality and image. I pressed my hand to the glass. Cold, smooth, unyielding. My reflection's hand met mine, but the fingers were slightly off, skewed, deliberate, almost teasing. A faint rustle brushed through the room, though I could see nothing else moving. The light shifted, stretching shadows along the mirrored walls. I could feel them curling, reaching, mirroring not just my shape, but my hesitation, my fear. I took a breath. The reflection's smile did not fade. It tilted its head, ever so slightly, watching, waiting, patient. I wanted to step back, but the room held me. The glass pressed its cold invitation into my chest. I blinked again. The lag remained. The smile lingered, and I knew it was waiting for me to reach again. I drew my hand away slowly. The reflection paused, then mirrored me, its expression softening just slightly, like it had expected me to hesitate. I exhaled. The room stayed silent, save for the faint hum and the whisper of my own heartbeat. The mirrors reflected me fully again, but I felt it, the unease lingering, like the glass had swallowed something small and left it waiting. I left the room, alone, but the reflection remained, smiling just a moment longer than it should have, in the pale, trembling light. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold stone. Pale light drifted across the floor, fractured and uneven. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching toward the walls. At the end of the hall, a figure appeared, a patient gown draped loosely over a small frame. It stood still, silent, almost waiting. I called softly. No answer. The air pressed against me, cool and heavy, carrying the faint tang of metal and dust. I stepped closer. The figure did not move. Its presence chilled me, a low weight settling into my chest. I blinked. It was closer, not walking, not moving, yet nearer than before. The hallway stretched behind me, empty, silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in the stillness, and the subtle hum of the building vibrating beneath the tiles. I reached out, hesitated. The pale visitor did not respond, but I felt it, softly brushing against the edge of awareness, an invisible hand folding into the air between us. The gown shifted slightly, as if breathed upon, its outline blurred in the pale light. Shadows deepened along the walls, curling toward it, leaning closer without touching. I stepped back. The air carried the faint smell of wet stone, and the quiet pressed against my ears, heavy, insistent. The figure remained, patient, waiting. I blinked again. It moved closer, not in steps, but in presence, pressing toward me in the space between breaths. I swallowed. The metallic tang on my tongue grew sharper. My palms felt damp. The hall seemed longer, colder, stretching endlessly behind the figure. I tried to call again. The words died in my throat. Only silence answered. I noticed a subtle shift of its shadow along the floor. It mirrored no shape I could see, yet it moved with intention, deliberate, unhurried, pressing against the corners of my vision. I pressed my back to the wall. Cold plaster grounded me. The pale light trembled across the tiles, and the figure remained, closer now, silent, watching. I breathed slowly, shallow. The hallway smelled faintly of wax and dust. The shadow thickened around the figure, like fog curling along the edges of shape I could almost touch. I did not move. I could not move. The pale visitor simply waited, its presence folding into the quiet, pressing softly against the edges of the hall. I took another careful step back. The figure did not change. Its gown fluttered faintly in the stagnant air, and the shadows along the walls whispered in motionless silence. I turned my head. The hall stretched endlessly behind me. The air was cold, damp, and heavy. The presence lingered, patient, and I felt it watching long after my gaze left it. I left the hallway slowly, alone, but the weight of the pale visitor pressed in the silence, soft and unyielding, folding into the memory of the hall, waiting. The room smelled of damp wood and cold stone. Wind whispered through the broken glass, carrying a faint metallic tang. Shards littered the floor, glinting in the pale, trembling light. I stepped closer to the windows. The edges cut faintly under my fingers, cold, sharp, pressing into my awareness. Outside, shapes moved, fleeting, impossible to define. They shifted between shadow and figure, between memory and presence, as if the world beyond the glass could not decide what it wanted to be. I blinked. The shapes changed. A hand raised and vanished. A figure lingered, then dissolved into fog. The wind tugged at my hair, curling it around my neck. The faint sound of rustling glass filled the hall behind me. I could feel the cold pressing through the broken windows, sliding along my arms, crawling beneath my coat. I stepped back, cautious. The shapes outside blurred and reformed, teasing the edges of recognition. I could not tell if they were people, shadows, or memories. The floor beneath my feet felt slick, damp with condensation from the broken panes. The wind hummed low, vibrating through the walls, and the faint scent of wet stone deepened. I reached toward the window. Fingers hovered above the glass. The shards trembled under the pressure of the air, but the shapes outside did not pause, drifting with patience, just beyond reach. The light shifted, bending across the room, catching fragments of broken glass in fleeting glimmers. Shadows stretched and recoiled across the floor, as if alive, folding over themselves with intention. I could hear my own breath. Slow, shallow. The wind tugged softly at my coat, at the hair around my ears. A low hum settled into my chest, like the building itself was holding its breath. I blinked again. The shapes outside had shifted closer. Closer, but still unreachable, as if aware I was watching, but unwilling to reveal themselves fully. I took another step back. The wind tugged harder, curling into the broken frames, and I felt it brush against my neck, cool, insistent, unsettling. I pressed my palm to the wall. The plaster was damp beneath my fingers, grounding me, but the uncertainty remained heavy in the air, pressing into my chest. The shapes flickered once more, gone, then returning, slipping in and out of reality. Like the fragments of a dream I could almost remember. I exhaled slowly. The room was quiet, save for the wind, the hum of the building, and the faint echo of movement beyond the glass. I stepped away, alone, but the memory of the shapes lingered, folding into the corners of the room, pressing softly against the edges of the shattered windows, waiting. The basement door smelled of damp wood and earth. A faint chill drifted up from the cracks along the floorboards. I descended the steps slowly, each one groaning softly beneath my weight. The air grew colder with each step. A low humming vibrated the walls, deep and steady. It pressed against my chest, like the building itself was alive and breathing. The light was pale, weak, flickering. Shadows stretched across the concrete, pooling in corners. I could feel them curling, moving with intention. I stepped carefully. The hum deepened, resonating beneath my feet, and I felt in my legs a vibration that seemed almost alive. Something brushed against my leg. Soft, fleeting, deliberate. I froze. The air smelled faintly of rust and damp stone. I leaned closer to the wall. The cold plaster pressed against my fingers. The hum wrapped around the basement like fog, curling into the corners, pressing at the floor, the walls, and my spine. I took a careful step forward. The light caught a shadow moving across the far wall. Then it vanished, leaving only trembling darkness. The air was heavy, thick, and the faint metallic tang lingered on my tongue. The humming shifted, rising slightly, then settling again, patient, unhurried. It seemed to respond to my heartbeat, pressing into the spaces between breaths. I moved another step. The shadow shifted with me, sliding along the wall like smoke, never fully forming, never fully leaving. I could hear faint rustling beneath the floorboards. Or was it behind the walls? The air pressed cold against my neck, and the floor seemed to pulse beneath my feet. I paused. The hum wrapped around me, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. The palms of my hands pressed against the cold concrete. Something brushed my leg again, softer this time. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I could feel it, patient, aware, waiting. The basement stretched endlessly in the weak light, shadows deepening along the edges, curling inward, folding the air into silence and hum. I breathed slowly, shallow. The metallic tang remained in the air. The humming pressed into my chest. The shadows pressed closer, without moving. I reached out, fingertips brushing the wall. Cold, damp grounding. The sensation beneath my hand barely touched the surface. Yet the presence was there, folded into the space between the humming, pressing lightly against my awareness. I did not move. I could not move. The basement held me, alive with low vibrations, dark shapes, and the subtle brush of something unseen. I stepped back slowly. The humming settled again, low, patient. The shadow lingered in the corner, and I felt it watching long after my gaze left it. I turned toward the stairs. Each step back felt heavier than before. The basement remained alive behind me, folded into the cold air, the hum, and the unseen presence brushing softly, pressing in quiet anticipation. The therapy room smelled faintly of polished wood and stale air. Pale light spilled through high windows, fractured across the floor. Chairs lined the space, all facing the same direction, empty, patient. I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked faintly under my weight. A soft hum vibrated through the air, subtle, almost unnoticed. I felt it immediately. The sensation of being watched, like eyes pressing softly into my back, tracing me with invisible hands. I turned slowly. Nothing moved. The chairs remained still, aligned, empty. A faint draft stirred the air, curling dust motes along the pale light. Then, almost imperceptibly, a chair rotated. I froze. The movement was deliberate, slow, patient. The air smelled faintly of wax and dust, and the room seemed to inhale with me. I took a step forward. The wood of the chair creaked faintly beneath the shift. Shadows lengthened along the walls, stretching toward me, folding over themselves in slow motion. I pressed my palm to the wall. Cold plaster grounded me. The feeling of being watched deepened, pressing softly at the edges of my awareness. I glanced around again. All the chairs were empty, but the rotating one, it had moved, slow, deliberate, patient. The soft hum persisted. The floor beneath me felt faintly alive, vibrating in time with the whisper of unseen breaths. I could taste faint dust in the air, metallic and sharp on the tongue. I stepped closer. The chair's rotation slowed, almost imperceptibly. Its shadows stretched along the floor, curling toward the wall, folding the light into itself. I exhaled slowly. The room remained still, save for the chair and the quiet sensation pressing at my skin, soft, insistent. I did not touch it. I could not. The air felt thick, heavy, folded with anticipation. I took another careful step. The chair rotated slightly more, leaning into the shadows, patient, deliberate. I pressed my hand to my chest. Cold pressed back. The hum deepened faintly, vibrating through floorboards and walls. I stepped back, slowly, and the chair continued its subtle, patient rotation. The room held me, folded into quiet observation, alive with the sensation of being watched. I turned toward the door. The pale light trembled along the empty chairs. The room smelled faintly of wax and dust. The chair rotated once more, and I knew it was waiting. I left, alone, but the sensation lingered, pressing softly against my memory of the room, patient, deliberate, watching. The hallway stretched long and narrow. Walls were pale, cracked, smelling faintly of dust and coal plaster. Faint light filtered from the ceiling, trembling across the floor. I stepped forward, soft, careful. My shoes pressed against the worn tiles, and each step echoed faintly, bouncing against the walls. Then I heard it, another set of footsteps, soft, deliberate, following me. I stopped. The other step stopped. Silence pressed in, heavy and patient, like the hallway itself was holding its breath. I breathed slowly. The air smelled faintly metallic, like iron lingering after rain. The walls seemed to lean closer, folding the sound of my heartbeat into the quiet. I stepped again. The footsteps followed, mirroring mine exactly. Not behind, not ahead. Beside me. I blinked. Shadows shifted along the walls. The hallway stretched longer with each pulse of movement, dark corners curling toward me, folding the air. I tried to slow my pace. The footsteps slowed with me. I froze. The silence pressed harder, filled with a subtle vibration of unseen presence. The floorboard beneath me felt slick, damp with condensation or something older. The faint hum of the building vibrated in the tiles. The footsteps remained, patient, pressing softly into the air around me. I whispered barely, a single sound. Nothing answered, only the echo of my own voice, swallowed immediately. I took a careful step backward. The footsteps mirrored again, not in front, not behind, but exactly following, matching my every motion with quiet insistence. The hallway smelled faintly of wet stone and dust. A breeze curled through, though no windows were open. Shadows stretched and folded, pressing at the edges of my vision. I pressed my palm to the wall. Cold plaster grounded me, but did not break the pressure being followed. The footsteps stopped again when I stopped. I felt them in the silence, patient, aware, waiting. I exhaled slowly. The hallway seemed endless. The air held itself tightly, folded around the echo of movement. I moved forward once more. Softly, careful, the footsteps resumed. Matching, patient. I could not see them. Could not tell if it was shadow or presence, but I could feel it. Near, mirroring. I left the hallway slowly. Alone, but the memory of mirrored steps pressed against me, folded into the quiet of the building, waiting. The corridor smelled faintly of rust and old wood. A lock clicked softly as I pushed open a door I hadn't noticed before. Pale light spilled in from the hall, trembling across the floor. Inside, the air was thick, musty, carrying the faint tang of disinfectant long gone stale. Rows of empty beds lined the walls, their sheets yellowed and brittle. Old medical tools rested on tables, polished faintly by dust and time. I stepped slowly. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight. Paper rustled softly, scattered patient records trembling in the draft. Shadows clung to the corners, deep and patient. I could feel them watching, pressing softly at the edges of the room, folding into the silence. I reached for a record. The pages were brittle, curling under my fingers. I inhaled slowly. The smell of old paper and rusted metal pressed against my nose, heavy and lingering. A low hum seemed to rise from the walls. Not mechanical, not electrical, almost alive, vibrating gently in my chest. I moved deeper into the ward. Each step echoed faintly. The bed seemed longer than before, stretching into corners I could not see. Shadows shifted along the walls, folding light into darkness, pressing the air around me. I paused. Something unseen lingered in the corner, patient, watching. The air felt heavier near it, cool against my skin, damp in the breath. I leaned closer to the table. The tools glinted faintly in the pale light, sharp edges pressed visually into my mind. The pages of scattered records whispered beneath my fingertips, as if breathing softly in anticipation. I moved along the ward slowly. The shadows did not follow, yet I felt their presence folding around me, pressing softly against my awareness. The air smelled of wet stone and iron. I pressed my palm against the wall, grounded myself in the cold plaster. The hum persisted, low, insistent, vibrating to the floorboards and tiles. I exhaled slowly. The room seemed to fold around me, stretching and shrinking, alive with subtle movement I could not see. I reached the far corner. The shadows deepened, curling along the walls, leaning closer without moving. I could feel the weight of eyes upon me, patient, silent. I stepped back toward the door. The ward remained still, folded into shadows, dust, and faint hum. The smell of rust and old paper lingered. The presence pressed softly in my memory, waiting, patient, unseen. I left the ward slowly, alone, but the memory of the space pressed against me, folded into the quiet, and the shadows remained in the corners, waiting. The hallway smelled faintly of wet stone and dust. Pale light from a single window stretched across the floor, trembling with the wind. I paused, noticing something press against the glass. Hands, pale, fragile, pressed flat against the outside. They lingered just beyond reach. Fingers splayed, trembling slightly in the dim light. I blinked. They vanished. The air felt colder where they had been. A subtle draft pressed against my neck, curling through my hair. I stepped closer. The floorboards whispered beneath my shoes. I could smell faint iron in the air, metallic and sharp. The window trembled under the faint pressure of the wind, or perhaps something else. I reached for the glass. Nothing. Cold, smooth, unbroken. But inside, I knew they had been there. I could feel it pressing against my chest, the quiet certainty of their presence. The shadows shifted behind me. I could sense movement in the corner of my vision, soft and deliberate. The wind rattled the window frame, but it was not the wind that made the cold crawl along my arms. I stepped back. The hands returned, faint and fleeting, as if aware I was watching, vanishing whenever I tried to focus fully. I inhaled slowly. The smell of wet stone and faint rust pressed in. The room felt smaller. Shadows leaned toward me, patient, stretching along the floor, folding the pale light into darkness. I pressed my palm against the wall. Cold plaster grounded me. The certainty of their presence pressed against my skin, silent, patient, insistent. I blinked again. The hands had vanished. Yet Inside, I knew they were still there, waiting, watching. The wind whispered along the window frame, curling dust motes through the pale light. I could feel the quiet, soft pressure of the unseen, folded into the cold air and shadows of the hall. I stepped back from the glass. The pale hands lingered in memory, etched into the tremor of the room. I breathed slowly, shallow. The certainty of their presence remained, pressing softly against my awareness. I left the window behind, alone, but the memory of pale hands pressed into my chest, folded into the shadows, and the faint, lingering hum of presence remained, patient, insistent, watching. The hallway smelled faintly of damp paint and old wood. Pale light trembled across the tiles, stretched thin by cracked windows. I heard at first a soft, eerie laughter, floating just beyond reach. It was quiet, delicate, almost playful. Yet beneath it lingered something else, cold, patient, insistent. The sound pressed gently against my chest, curling through my rib cage. I stepped forward. The floorboards whispered beneath my shoes, echoing faintly into the corners of the hall. The laughter drifted farther ahead, always just beyond my reach. I blinked. The light shifted slightly, pale and uneven, casting shadows that stretched along the walls like fingers. The sound moved with me, slipping through the hall, weaving around corners, patient. I moved faster. The laughter followed, keeping pace without advancing. The air smelled faintly of old paper and cold stone, pressed damp and metallic against my skin. I stopped. The laughter paused. Then it resumed softly, teasing, curling through the walls, pressing gently into the quiet of the hall. I tried to locate it. Corners, doorways, cracks in the walls. Nothing, yet I could feel its presence, folded into the shadows, waiting. I stepped forward again. The laughter danced farther ahead. Each step I took, each careful breath, the sound remained just beyond, patient, teasing, deliberate. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching in both directions. Shadows leaned and folded along the walls, pressing the pale light into angles I could not reach. The laughter continued, soft and curling, wrapping itself around the edges of my awareness. I pressed my hand to the wall. Cold plaster grounded me, but did not stop the subtle pressure of presence. The sound brushed against me like a finger on my shoulder, soft, fleeting, teasing. I tried to blink it away. The laughter slipped through, patient, deliberate, teasing. I could feel in the air, pressing softly into the empty spaces. I exhaled slowly. The hall remained quiet, pale, and long. The laughter had moved on, or maybe it had never left. It lingered in memory, soft, teasing, patient. I turned and left the hallway, alone, yet the sound remained folded into the air, pressing gently against my chest, insistent, quiet, unreachable. The children's ward smelled faintly of old paint and lavender. A single nightlight hummed softly, flickering against the pale walls. Shadows danced, stretching across the floor and up the beds. I stepped closer. The air was cool, still, pressing lightly against my skin. The light shifted. Shapes twisted and folded in the corner of my vision. Faces, small, pale faces forming and dissolving into shadows. The floor creaked faintly beneath my shoes. I could smell the faint scent of dust and worn blankets, pressing softly into the quiet. I blinked. The shapes changed, twisting again, familiar and strange, watching from the corners of the room. I pressed my hand to the wall. Cold plaster grounded me, but could not stop the subtle pressure of presence. The shadows leaned closer, folding the faint light into angles I could not follow. I exhaled slowly. The night light flickered again, faces melting into darkness, then forming elsewhere. The room smelled faintly of wax and old wood, a soft impress against my chest. The shapes swirled with it, folding and twisting, patient, quiet, alive in memory if not in reality. I stepped back. The shadows shifted. The floorboards whispered beneath my feet. The room felt longer than before, folding into corners that had not been there moments ago. I blinked. The shapes dissolved completely. Silence pressed against me, soft, patient, insistent. I left the nightlight behind. The shadows receded, folding themselves into the corners of memory. Yet the faint hum lingered, a presence folded into the quiet of the ward. Patient, watching, waiting. The hallway smelled faintly of varnish and dust. A pale light spilled from a cracked doorway, soft and uneven. A melody drifted, small and fragile, curling along the walls. A music box, playing by itself. The tune was familiar, sad and hollow, like a memory folded into the corners of the room. I stepped closer. The floorboards whispered beneath my feet, pressing the soft hum of the music into my chest. I could smell faint wax and old wood, pressed warm and dry against the cold air. I reached for the box. The tune continued, curling around my fingers, melancholy and patient. Something brushed my hand, light, fleeting, a presence folded into the air, unseen but insistent. I paused. The shadows shifted along the walls, folding the pale light into corners I could not reach. The air smelled faintly of old paper and stone, metallic and dry, pressing gently into my lungs. The melody wound around me. Notes hovered in the quiet, stretching long into the corners of the empty hallway. I could feel the pressure of presence again, patient, gentle, insistent. I drew my hand back. The tune continued, wrapping the room in its fragile sorrow. The air felt heavy, damp, alive with memory. I blinked. The shadows folded closer, stretching the pale light across the floor and walls. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust, pressed soft and quiet against my skin. The music slowed slightly, then continued, patient, deliberate, wrapping the empty hallway around me, folded into the silence, and brushing softly against my chest like a hand I could not see. I stepped back from the music box, alone, yet the tune lingered, pressed into the air, soft, sad, insistent, a presence folded into the quiet memory of the room. The hallway smelled faintly of damp stone and old paint. A pale light flickered at the far end, soft and uneven. Shadows stretched along the walls, coiling and twisting with subtle patience. Voices drifted through the corridor, soft, faint, echoing. They spoke my name, but the mouths moved not. Not a sound came from anyone. Yet the air pressed it against my ears. I stepped forward. The floor whispered beneath my shoes, cold beneath my skin. Shadows shifted in time with my breath. I could smell the faint musk of old fabric and the metallic hint of rusted fixtures. I blinked. The voices moved closer, curling around corners and angles. They were patient, insistent. I felt them pressing lightly against my chest, like a presence folded into the cold air. I reached out toward the shadows. They recoiled slightly, curling along the walls. The light shifted and stretched, painting the floor in pale, trembling rectangles. The voices spoke again, soft, intimate, folded into the quiet. I could not see the speakers. Only shadows, coiling, patient, waiting. A faint rustle pressed against my ear, like cloth brushing slowly along a chair. The air smelled of old plaster and damp stone, cold and alive, pressing into my lungs. I stepped back. The shadows seemed to lean closer. The voices whispered again, patient, insistent, curling the silence around me like a blanket I could not escape. The corridor stretched longer than before, folding corners into corners I had not seen. Light trembled, flickered, then held steady again, leaving shadows coiled along the walls, watching. I exhaled softly. The voices faded slightly, leaving the corridor empty but not quiet. Something lingered, pressing in the stillness. I could feel it in my chest, in the tremor of the floor beneath my feet, in the faint metallic scent that hung in the air. I left the corridor behind. The shadows remained patient, coiled, and the whispers, soft and insistent, followed me only in memory, folded into the quiet, folded into the silence that waited in the hallways. The staircase smelled faintly of polished wood and dust. A pale light filtered through a cracked window, shaking slightly with the wind. The air pressed cool against my skin, carrying a faint metallic tang. I placed my foot on the first step. Soft footsteps echoed above me. They were light at first, almost hesitant, but precise, matching each movement I made. I climbed slowly. The steps above mirrored mine perfectly. A hum of tension vibrated through the railing beneath my hand, cold and smooth, pressing into my palm. I paused. The footsteps did too, then continued, louder, heavier, folding themselves into floorboards, pressing quiet around me like a weight. The smell of old varnish rose from the stairs. A faint creak whispered under my weight, but the footsteps above never faltered. They followed, patient, relentless, echoing in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I looked up. Nothing. The stairwell stretched, pale light trembling along the walls. Shadows clung to corners, curling and twisting like they were alive, waiting, patient. I moved again. The footsteps grew sharper, pressing closer, a muted echo against my chest. I could feel them in the air, heavy, insistent, coiled in the space above. The wind outside whispered through broken panes, rustling the edges of the curtain, pressing cold air along my neck. The silence between my steps was a presence, filled with expectation, folded into the cold beneath my shoes. I climbed the last few steps. The air smelled faintly of old plaster and dust, pressed thick and damp against my lungs. The footsteps stopped at the top, then slowly, deliberately, mirrored my last pause. I exhaled softly. The light trembled and held. Shadows lingered along the walls, patient, coiled. The silence remained heavy, and the echo of footsteps stayed in my chest, long after I stopped moving. The room smelled faintly of mothballs and damp wood. Pale light leaked through a cracked window, brushing along the floorboards. Dust floated in the air, settling slowly, almost as if time itself were still. An old wardrobe stood in the corner. Its surface was scratched, faded, and cold to the touch. I reached for the handle. It creaked when I pulled it open, slow, deliberate like a sigh. Inside, patient gowns swayed gently. Nothing moved them. No breeze touched the room. Yet they floated as if someone wore them, invisible forms pressing lightly against the fabric. The air grew thick. I felt eyes along my spine, watching, waiting, patient. A hum of tension vibrated in the walls, soft, almost imperceptible, pressing against my chest. I leaned closer. The gowns shifted again. The faint scent of old soap and linen drifted toward me, tangled with something metallic, sharp, like old hospital tools left too long. The wardrobe seemed alive. Shadows stretched across the walls, curling and twisting where the light failed to reach. Each gown rocked slightly in its own rhythm, as if breathing quietly, rhythmically, swaying to a melody I could not hear. I pressed my hand against the wood of the wardrobe. It was cold, damp, smooth. The sound of soft fabric brushing itself echoed faintly in the empty room, a whisper of movement that belonged to nothing and yet filled the space with presence. I stepped back. The air felt heavier, pressing into my lungs, turning my breath shallow, careful. Something lingered in the corners of my vision, a shape or the suggestion of one, and it vanished whenever I blinked. The gowns swayed again. I could feel them observing, not hostile, but patient, curious, waiting. The smell of the room pressed deeper into my memory. Faded perfume, dust, cold metal, all mingling into a sensation I could not name. I closed the wardrobe slowly. The creak echoed once, hollow, then faded into the quiet of the empty room. The pale light shifted slightly, the dust settling, but the sensation of being watched remained, soft, insistent, lingering. I stepped away. The silence held, thick with presence, and I realized the wardrobe had not closed on its own. I had closed it, yet the eyes, the air, the sway remained, and I could not tell if they ever truly left. The hallway ended in a door I didn't recognize. I pushed it open. Darkness swallowed everything beyond. My flashlight trembled in my hand. Its pale circle cut a thin path through the black. Dust motes floated in the beam, suspended like tiny ghosts. The air smelled damp, stale, heavy. It pressed into my lungs, slow, deliberate, watching. I could hear my own breath, uneven, too loud in the silence. Then another sound. Shallow, quiet, a rhythm not mine. Breathing, close, soft, careful. It moved with me. I stepped forward. The beam touched the edges of the room. Walls faded into nothing. Shadows clung to the corners, pooling and curling. I paused. The breathing slowed when I slowed. It quickened when I dared to step. The dark seemed to shift around me, pulling at the edges of the light. The floor smelled of damp wood and something metallic. I could feel the cold press against my feet. Tiny hairs on my arms standing at attention. I whispered my own name. No answer. Yet the breath lingered, steady, patient, near. I could feel it brushing against the back of my neck. Cold, almost wet. The flashlight flickered. The dark moved faster than my eyes could follow. Shapes flitted just beyond the circle of light. Impossible forms, like shadows shaped by memory, coiling and uncoiling in rhythm with the breathing that I wanted to turn to flee. But something held me in place. Curiosity or fear, or both. The sound of air being drawn slowly, deliberately, a presence leaning into me without form but my hand brushed a wall. It was rough, splintered, cold. The flashlight quivered in my grip, and then I felt it a hand, or just the suggestion of one, brushing mine. Soft. Waiting I stepped backward. The breathing followed, close, almost comforting in its persistence. The room did not end. The shadows did not stop. That I shut my eyes. The dark became a weight. I could feel it breathing around me, the space between my heartbeats stretching. When I opened them, the beam fell on nothing. Yet I knew the presence remained. The hush of the room, the scent of damp and metal, the unblinking awareness pressing in, all told me I was not alone, that I edged toward the door. The dark seemed to recede just enough to let me pass. My footsteps were soft, careful, blending with the rhythm of the other breathing. That I reached the threshold. The hallway beyond felt lighter, colder. The room behind me remained, alive with silence and shadow. I left, but the sound, the pressure, the feeling of being watched without eyes, lingered in my chest. That I would return. The memory of the breath followed me down the hall, soft, insistent, patient, waiting for the next time I dared enter the dark. The hallway smelled faintly of varnish and dust. A single beam of pale light fell across the wall, and there was a portrait, framed in chipped wood, of a patient I did not know. Eyes wide, dark, almost too human. I stepped closer. The air felt heavier here, warm, stagnant, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I reached out, but my fingers trembled. The paint seemed to shimmer beneath my gaze. Their eyes followed me, slow, deliberate, a gaze that weighed against my chest. And then, almost imperceptibly, they began to fade. The colors drained, leaving the canvas pale, gray. Hollowed, I blinked. The face was still there. Or perhaps I imagined it, lingering in the edge of memory. A hush of silence pressed against the walls. The smell of old paper, of time passing unmarked, filled my nostrils. I could hear the faint hum of the building, the subtle creak of settling wood. But the portrait seemed alive, or dying. Their eyes followed me again. Closer now, intimate, mourning. And then, gone. A blank canvas stared back. Something inside me ached. A hollow, cold pull, like reaching for someone lost. The floorboards under my feet whispered as I shifted weight. The walls seemed to lean closer, listening that I traced the edges of the frame with my fingertips. The wood was rough, dry, brittle. A shiver ran down my spine, like the room remembered the person who had once existed here. I stepped back. The light caught the corner of the canvas. A shadow flickered across it, but it belonged to nothing alive. I could almost hear a sigh, soft, distant, carried on the still air. It was a sound that belonged to absence, to memory left unspoken. I lingered, wanting to see the eyes again, to feel that strange connection, but the portrait would not return. Only the faint outline, a suggestion of what had been, remained. The silence pressed closer. Every breath felt loud, intrusive. I could hear my heartbeat in the empty corridor, a reminder that I was here and they were not. I turned away slowly. The hallway stretched before me, empty and quiet. The portrait faded further in my mind, but the ache it left followed. A hollow weight, patient and unyielding. I whispered the patient's name. No answer, only the hum of the building, the soft rustle of my own clothes, and the shadowed absence where life had once looked back at me. I walked on, but the emptiness lingered, a gentle, aching memory etched into the walls, into the fading light, into me. The hallway smelled of damp paint and old stone. Evening light filtered through dusty windows, pale and uneven. The walls were familiar. I knew every crack, every shadow. And then a door where none should be, with grain dark, cold under my fingertips. The edges seemed to hum faintly, like the room had been waiting. I hesitated. The air was heavy, thick with dust and something unspoken. My breath felt loud in my ears. I turned the handle. The wood gave with a whisper. A corridor stretched before me, endless. Flickering lights cast shadows that twisted in elongated shapes moving where nothing should. I stepped forward. The floor underfoot groaned softly, tiles cold, smooth, and somehow alive. Each step echoed, but there were other echoes, closer, sharper. Then I heard it, my own voice, quiet, hesitant, whispering back to me from the darkness. It said nothing new, only repeated my own fear, folding it back like a mirror. The walls seemed to breathe. Shadows pooled at the corners, reaching slowly, curling around the flickering light. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something rotten, an old memory I could not place. I stopped. The corridor did not. It stretched beyond reason, beyond sight. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a pressure on my chest as if the hall itself were inhaling. The lights flickered again. Shapes moved just beyond vision. I turned my head, and the shadows seemed to coil in acknowledgement, as if aware of my presence, welcoming or warning. My hand brushed the wall. Cold, rough, real, but it was not mine alone. A whisper of movement, a breath in the darkness, trailing just behind me. I called out softly. No answer, only the echo of my own voice, twisting, returning altered. The corridor seemed to pulse with it, alive and patient. I walked further, each step heavier, longer, the air thickening around me. The shadows leaned closer, folding over themselves, watching, waiting. A soft rustle, like paper moving under unseen fingers. I froze. The corridor seemed to stretch even farther, a space that should not exist. My hand found another door. It was solid, familiar. I opened it. Another corridor, endless. The whisper followed, closer now, repeating the soft tremor of my own fear. I breathed. The air smelled faintly of mildew and metal, of spaces that time had forgotten. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, though I knew it could not. I turned. The door I had come through was gone. The wall stood empty, unbroken. Only the corridor remained, infinite, flickering, and my whisper returning, folded into the dark. I took another step. The lights flickered again. A shadow brushed against me. No shape, no substance, but I knew I was not alone. The hallway pulsed quietly, alive with absence, with breath and memory and fear. I moved forward. The whisper followed, always following, and I knew, somehow, it always would. The autumn wind pressed against the asylum windows. Branches scraped the glass, thin and brittle. Inside, the hall smelled of damp stone and old air. I walked slowly, my steps muted by the thick carpet. Each door I passed seemed heavier, the shadows pooling quietly at their edges. And then, at the far end, I saw it, the figure I had glimpsed before. Standing, pale and still, the air around them seemed to hum. I stopped, my breath caught. The floor felt cold through my shoes, as if the tiles themselves held a memory of past footsteps. The figure turned its head slightly. Its eyes did not meet mine. Yet somehow, I felt the weight of recognition, an understanding that was not spoken aloud. The corridor stretched long behind us. Flickering light painted the walls in pale streaks. Shadows leaned inward, attentive, but the figure remained silent at first. Then it spoke. A voice soft, distant, not meant for me, yet I understood each word. The message was not a warning. It was a memory, folded into the air, pressing against my chest like a familiar ache. It lingered, and I felt it enter me, changing the space inside. I could hear the hum of the building around us, the ventilation sighing like breath. A chair creaked somewhere in the distance. I was alone, yet not. I stepped forward. The figure did not move. The words continued in silence, the meaning settling into my bones. I felt the old way of the asylum, the sorrow of rooms long abandoned, the patient story stitched into the walls. The light flickered again. I smelled faintly the tang of rust and old fabric. The figure's presence was certain, its absence just as real, a paradox pressing on the edges of perception. I left the hallway slowly. Each step carried a whisper of understanding, a quiet acceptance that some things linger beyond sight. The figure watched, its voice dissolving into the hum of the building. I opened the front doors. The night air was cold and sharp. The The wind carried away the scent of the asylum, but not the feeling it had left behind. I paused. For a moment, I felt the echo of that pale presence, a lingering note of something more than memory, something that was both gone and everywhere. The street was empty. Street lights glimmered in the fog. I felt my pulse slow, the world outside heavy with normalcy, yet altered. The figure remained behind, silent, unchanged, watching the shadows of the halls I crossed. I did not look back. I did not need to. I walked forward, but a part of me stayed within those walls, among the whispers and the soft breath of forgotten rooms, carrying a quiet understanding that some presences leave marks no one sees. The night pressing around me, cool and still, and I knew that the asylum and its patient would always exist somewhere beyond sight, a quiet echo beneath my own,